Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Laura with Connect My Brain. So glad that you're tuning in. We are working on the World of Reflexes. This is probably going to be the last one, though, that I do as it relates to primitive reflexes, not because we're finished, but because there's just so much to that. I could spend maybe the next 3 or 4 months just talking about reflexes, and I certainly don't want you to get bored. I like to keep you on your toes. That's what's really good for your brain as well. So today we are going to talk about the Tonic Labyrinthine Reflex. This particular reflex is part of the primitives, but it is a bridge to what we call the postural reflexes. So let's give just a few minutes of a background in case this is the first one you're tuning into, and we're glad you're here, and make sure you share this podcast. So primitive reflexes are reflexes that are actually laid down in every single human being while you are in your mother's womb. But over the years, we've really learned that if these reflexes do not integrate in a timely manner, they can trip up development. Here at Connect My Brain, I would say 95% of our patients are children. We do see some adults, but most of them are children. And because of my work in the primitive reflexes, I have literally created an all-encompassing program that is designed to get at the root cause of different situations that are creating a problem, especially with child development. Reflexes are one of those things, and it's very common. In fact, it is the primitive reflexes that actually got me into neurofeedback. So I've been doing reflex work probably since 2000. I've been doing neurofeedback work since 2008. What got me into neurofeedback was having a quantifiable way to measure a chronic stress pattern. Now, if you go back to the beginning of the reflexes from the podcast, we first talked about the withdrawal reflexes. Then we went into officially what is called the primitive reflexes. And the first one that we talked about was the Moro reflex. In my opinion, this particular reflex, the Moro reflex, is the enchilada of all reflexes. In fact, I have never found a child who did not have at least the Moro still firing as well as others. And as we wrap up today with our reflexes, I'm going to kind of give you that big picture idea. But the Moro reflex activates 3 things in the neurology: arousal, CO2O2 reflex, and the sympathetic nervous system. And it is intimately tied into several other reflexes, but especially the tonic labyrinthine reflex, which from now on I'm going to call the TLR, because it is all about what goes on through the vestibular system. And this vestibular system is 3 canals inside of your ear, behind your drum, deep into that canal. Those 3 canals have a fluid flowing through it, and these little hair projections. And every time you move, the fluid moves, and that fluid begins to tell the brain by its direction where you are going in space. It also represents emotions. So, for example, if I'm feeling down and depressed, my posture is forward, my head is down. So for the podcast audience, I literally just showed that, and you can go over and see the podcast also on the YouTube channel, Dr. Laura Hansen. What does feeling confident and positive represent in our posture? It's upright. It's almost like a Peter Pan. So we have a physical manifestation of how we feel. And that too is bringing that information back through the vestibular system, communicating to the brain. So when we talk about reflexes, we want to make sure that people understand these are not just isolated events that go on. They're like a tapestry. They're like a concert. They all work together. They may have different times that they go on and different times that they are going to be inhibited or integrated into the neurology. But at some moment in time, they all share something together. Reflexes in general are laying down information. And this is information that it precedes, comes before sensory motor. Therefore, we have to understand that this ability to take information from our environment, that sensory input, and incorporate it into some type of motor output actually has a whole neurological circuit before it ever comes online and takes over. That is why it's important to look at these reflexes. They all do something to the neurology. They do something, they make something happen, and then they mature. So, for example, the very first set we talked about was the withdrawal reflexes. Literally, our nervous system is going to be primed to know how to survive before it tries to do anything else. And then there's going to be this magnificent transition. That's such a powerful word when it comes to reflexes, child development, and what is your child going through? How do they transition from one thing to another? Every part, every step we take has such a magnificent component to how this system is going to get wired. The withdrawal reflexes grow up to let you know anything with a very light touch is going to give you input to tell you if you're safe or not. Anything light in the periphery, it could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be tactile. So for example, if I'm cooking and I skim my arm on a hot pot, I certainly do not sit there and go, wow, my flesh is burning. We pull that arm away so fast without thinking. That's the power behind a reflexive action. It has an input, it creates an action, it creates maturation, and it leads to that next step, like sensory motor. So there's so many kids today that will have this kind of a label. They have sensory motor dysregulation. Well, reflexes come before sensory motor integration. And I do believe that when you get to the most, as far back as you have to go, if you can figure out, I always talk about it as a set of dominoes. You know, you set up a line of dominoes. Maybe it's got all kinds of turns. There's champions out there that do this. But what happens if I take one of those dominoes out of the sequence, it stops. Okay? So if we go as far back as we need to go and figure out where that neurological interruption occurred, and we work that part, many times I have seen the whole system take off and go. That is the power behind these reflexes. So let's talk about the tonic labyrinthine reflex. This is a reflex that begins in two parts. I'm going to first describe what it looks like. So, and again, if you have an opportunity and can go listen to the YouTube channel so you can see the video, please do that. But I'll be as descriptive as I can. So I want everybody in their mind's eye to imagine a little baby, and they are typically very flexed. And that's the first part of TLR, is the flexion, which literally is enlisted in the womb. That baby is in flexion. When babies are born, they're still in flexion. However, we went through the birth process last time. After that baby goes through the birth canal, and the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex helps the baby get the shoulders out, the broadest point, then the baby is going to go and have the paraspinal muscles compressed by the pelvis of mom, front and back. And that is spinal gallant. Then, as that baby is being compressed and stretched out, their little toes are going to push off and they're going to be birthed by extension. And extension is the other half of TLR. So I'm in flexion. When my head crosses the horizontal midline, I will go into flexion. When my head crosses the posterior or the back side of me, when I cross that midline, I'm going into extension. So this has a very unique action while it's in the womb and during birth. Now, that first part, the flexion, will typically integrate or inhibit. So it comes in, it does its work, and then there's going to be a time frame that it's going to stop. And it's meant to stop, the flexion part is meant to stop around 4 months. Now, if you've been following, that may sound familiar to you because Moro should inhibit around 4 months. So Moro, baby is in flexion, something suddenly happens. The baby takes a deep breath and opens up, and then that baby comes back into flexion. So we go from flexion, open to extension, back to flexion. All three of those movements are pivoting around the center of the torso. Yes, connect that dot. This is the beginning of that baby to interact with gravity. And what has to happen in order to interact with gravity is torso or trunk control, core control. Well, TLR is a larger flexion and extension, but both the TLR and Moro share this very intimate relationship with the vestibular apparatus inside of the ear. This is always one of the tests that I will do with each and every child, is to figure out, how is your vestibular system working? It is such an important part because there's neurological intimacy between the vestibular, the vision center, and the auditory system. So even over the years, back around 2008, I actually created a piece of medical equipment that I termed Triangle of Development. And it is a protocol that is going to bring lots of stimulation to those three areas, vestibular, eyes, and ears, in order to bring them back online, bring them into an orchestra together so that they are working together. Typically, what I find is if one of those areas are off, the eyes are off, then vestibular and auditory are off, and vice versa for auditory, then vestibular and eyes, and vestibular off, both eyes and ears are off. And all three of those systems have developmental windows. But the one that is most powerful is the vestibular system. It's believed to be the first system that comes online, and it's believed to be the one that is first myelinated, meaning reaching its maturation. So when we look at all of these reflexes, every one of them have a movement pattern to them. Every one of them have a vestibular component. But what's unique about Moro and TLR, it is about the head. The head is controlling what the body is going to do. So the head is going to move first in both Moro and TLR. Moro, that baby is going to take that big deep breath. The head goes back, the body opens up, and then there is the exhale and everything comes back together. TLR, that head is moving across the front of the body, crossing the midline, bringing the whole body into flexion, and then the opposite for extension. The extension component is not meant to inhibit until age 3. So when we have a reflex that has a long-standing platform, we must realize that it has an incredible influence on anything else that is developing at that time. So what else is developing from birth until 3 years? Well, sit down and take notes and let me tell you. So when you come into this world, your eyes see 2400, not 2020. However, in 10 rapid weeks, that child is going to move towards more adult-like vision. They actually have the same size eyeball. Their face grows into their eyeball. Your ear, when you come into this world, you hear low frequency sounds, and those frequencies are organized on what's called the cochlea, and specifically the membrane analyzer. And the low frequency sounds begin at the base, and over 3 years taking in all of the sound of the world, which is a special sense, hearing, vision, special senses. And it's going to totally reorganize that cochlea to where eventually the low frequency sound is actually then going to be all the way in the middle at the apex. And all the other frequencies that you've acquired are going to be laid down. In addition, your gut develops by age 2, your immune system age 3. Can we see how these things overlap? If I'm a kid with chronic ear infections, immune disruption, what is that going to do to the sense of sound, the organization of sound, and the work of the vestibular system, and how these reflexes are ultimately going to either continue and not integrate, and therefore constantly trip up that little individual. This is such an ongoing thing because there's this confusion. These reflexes are down in the brainstem, and the brainstem is meant to release. And if that doesn't happen, what we are going to end up with is, I don't know where I am in space. Well, that has several different avenues as well. You can be a kid that throws yourself on the ground. You can be a kid that runs into walls or other people, because it gives you proprioceptive input because you're not quite sure where you are. So you have to look for more sensory input in order to navigate your way. And as I have said, probably on every podcast, children do not have a point of reference for this stuff. They're not going to come up to us and say, I really don't think I'm interacting in gravity correctly. And therefore, every time I run into the wall or run into a person, it kind of gives me this feeling, hey, there's me. There's so much to do with gravity. Think about, how long does it take baby human to stand up and be able to take a step? When you are a newborn, if I were to go and hold you up underneath your little arms, and I took your foot and I placed it on a hard surface, you would absolutely take a step, because the stepping reflex is hardwired into baby human. But when I would move my hands, that baby would fall down because it doesn't know how to be in gravity. I get mind boggled by this. It takes us a year to figure this out. So it's a big deal. If I am not communicating with gravity, I've got to find all other kinds of ways to try to do that. And the list can really be endless, but you could be a child that gets carsick. So you're sitting behind the front seat and you can't really see the horizon. So your eyes cannot get that input, and the car's moving around. You start moving around and your little vestibular system says, I don't know what's going on, and you get sick. You may avoid wanting to be on your belly. You may avoid doing things like learning to ride a bicycle. I cannot begin to tell you how many children I have helped learn how to ride bicycles, and especially at the office where we are today. We are so blessed. We have a cul-de-sac, and the warmer weather is coming, and we will have more kids out there. This is a rite of passage. If a child is avoiding something, this is a red flag. Children should want to get on those bicycles, especially for the boys. It's the first set of wheels, the wind in the hair. You're free, you're moving. Children that are so afraid to get up on a bicycle seat, they're afraid they're going to fall. What about a toe walker? That's a very common one. That child does not put their heels of their feet down because they are afraid they're going to walk backwards. I'm sorry, fall backwards, not walk backwards. Now, let's really get this message of gravity. When the astronauts used to go to the moon, especially before NASA figured out that they need to exercise and move. Remember, they used to be in those white suits and big helmets, and then they changed the whole protocol because they were literally losing their ability to interact with gravity. We would see them when they would take off, but we would not see them when they would come back. We saw their picture on the news, but we didn't see them. Do you remember the movie Wall-E? Well, they would come back very large, swollen, inflamed, because that was an inflammatory process to leave gravity for their bodies. But the other things that happened is they began to write, like pen to paper, right to left. And they began to turn their letters and numbers around. I must hear that in probably every 2 assessments, or see it in my assessment, that this child is perceiving letters and numbers a certain way. This is what happens when you are not interacting with gravity like you're supposed to, and that is the big essence of the TLR, because it's teaching you how to move through that space. Let me combine it too with the asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. So if you remember the A, T, and R, you'd turn your head, say, to the right, and the right arm and leg would go out. This was splitting you down the middle. And your body, literally from top to bottom, had to go back then and learn how to communicate both sides in order to have a typical cross-crawl walking pattern, or crawling pattern, or creeping pattern. TLR is going to cut you at the waist, meaning it is putting that horizontal midline. That when you cross over, you go into flexion. When you go backwards, you go into extension. It's very interesting because when you look at the vestibular system, and again, go check this out on YouTube. You have 3 canals. You have an anterior, a posterior, and a horizontal. The movements that we see from these reflexes literally intimately match the anatomical, the functional components of that vestibular system. This is where my passion really got generated for going into this work, because I would see so many kids that had something going on with the vestibular, something going on with their eyes, something going on with their ears, and I used to spend all of my time working on this. And then, coupled with a wonderful human being, Larry Schultz, we put together the triangle of development. It is his fantastic work of creating different apparatuses that could simulate the vestibular motion. And then we put it together with an auditory piece and a visual piece in order to integrate that system. And it is phenomenal to do that kind of work. And by putting that piece of equipment together, it has allowed us, freed us up to work on so many other things, and then have this isolated time when we can work on the vestibular eyes and ears. So what do you do when all these reflexes are still firing? When they're still battling inside and really wanting to drive many things and not allowing that little person to go forward? Well, the easiest answer is we take a look at your child. I'm so cautious about giving clinical information and just put it out there and let people do that, because I've seen from different authors of books and webinars and seminars and etc. will just throw certain things out there, and there isn't enough of a clinical eye watching. And the next thing you know, that child is not doing well, and you have to go back now even further. So I've tried to give you some things to look at. From the withdrawal aspect, if your child is highly distracted, there's a really good chance that those withdrawal reflexes are still firing. If they are highly apprehensive about going places, hiding behind you, not wanting to engage, I would say it's withdrawal and moro together. If your child has attention issues, moro has always been at the heart of robbing children that ability for sustained focus. Now, again, these are not just by themselves. We are only in this area of primitive reflexes, so I want to make sure that you realize many other things, of course, can be going on. There's a very specific brain pattern you see in neurofeedback that is very highly correlated to children having attention issues. But I will tell you, I usually will get confirmation by all the other things that we do that will help us really focus in on the whole child. I don't believe that only one direction is going to change everything. Especially, many people have never even heard of primitive reflexes. So the chances are, if you're listening to this, you may have a child that's 8, 9, or 10 years old. And you may be sitting here going, my gosh, that sounds just like my child. And your child now has been on planet Earth for those number of years. So there's other things going on. And then we got to look at the chemistry. The chemistry is what really holds everything together. I could be really great at working on reflexes and doing neurofeedback. But if the individual doesn't have the right fuel, it's not going to stick. We humans are an orchestra. And when you bring all the pieces together, that's what makes the best results. Palmar reflex. So again, my podcast audience, what I typically see is the hand is still wrapped around the writing instrument. And it may look like the pen between the third and fourth finger. It may be, around the pinky. It could be in many different postures except for the pincer grip. Their handwriting, complaining of handwriting. Can you imagine if you had this reflex still firing? You literally, your hand would ache every single time that you would try to write, and you wouldn't want to write. ATNR, asymmetrical tonic neck reflex. You're having a lot of trouble crossing the midline because your body is still locked in that column, in that lateral column, and you don't have a good cross-crawl pattern. We also did the rooting reflex. So when it came to rooting, anything that had anything to do with the mouth, the hand, and the foot, which is really Babkin, but it's enough to realize that it all starts at the mouth. That was the survival mechanism in order to ensure that your baby would feed. The thing that is coming up all the time is tongue tie. And this is where there is tissue very close to the midline of the tooth. And it can be right under the lip. It can be under the tongue. It can be under the top lip or the bottom lip, but it can also be on the sides. This would throw off so many things. And we will get into a functional neurophysiological section where we're going to talk about labs and what this chemistry really means. But that's DNA. And it is highly related to a mutation on the MTHFR gene enzyme, and it can cause midline defect, and that's really what a tongue tie is. But this would restrict the child for feeding, for speaking, and breathing, because the tongue cannot get away from the back of the throat. So similar things are seen when a rooting reflex continues. And then we talked about spinal gallant. Spinal gallant, especially, I think probably the most familiar thing would be children continuing to wet the bed. Many people try to get those little ones out of diapers very, very quickly, and I would caution you. Again, there's a developmental time, and you may be really good at it, but most of the time what I have found is children that have potty trained early typically regress. A child can be potty trained when they can pedal a tricycle, because they are now feeling that transverse abdominis, which is directly in front of the bladder. But children that continue to wet the bed, wet themselves, could still have a retained spinal gallant. And then we talked about today was the tonic labyrinthine reflex. Some things that go on with an uninhibited reflex for TLR is poor posture, low tone, weak tone, vestibular problems, problems with balance, they get carsick, they don't like sporting activities, oculomotor issues, poor sequencing skills, poor sense of time and direction. So these are things that you can look at as it relates to your child. Now, this is only a handful of the reflexes. There are so many. Moro, Palmer, Plantar, ATNR, Gallant, Suck, Rooting, TLR, Abdominal, Babinski, the Writing Reflex, Landau, Amphibian, Segmental, STNR. They're all related to the sensory systems, which are vestibular, touch, auditory, visual, olfactory, and motor cues. This is what's at the heart of a child who is not moving forward. These reflexes are so powerful that if something happened to you as an adult, stroke, heart attack, brain injury, certainly not talking that over anyone, but your brain would actually go back to these reflexes because they are the rudimentary place of all learning. If you suspect that your child has retained primitive reflexes, reach out. We can do things remote. We can do things in-house. But once we get this thing moving, the dominoes can certainly flow. I always enjoy talking to you. Please go over to the website, connectmybrain.com, download Dr. Laura Hanson's developmental milestones. It's a summary of all the milestones that children go through. And that too can be an eye-opener for you to look at your own child. Feel free to reach out. You can put an inquiry through the website. Tell me days and times that you're available, and we'll set up a time to chat. We look forward to serving you here at Connect My Brain. Feel free to call the office, 678-501-5172. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be blessed, and we will see you the next time.